And go.
Hey man, thanks for having me back on. You said you're having Arbor Jet Joe on there from the Discovery Forestry podcast. I was just on that actually last week, so that's kind of cool. I think it's a great platform, casual conversation about arboriculture from some pretty cool people in the industry. So, as I said, it's good to be back. I'm going to talk about pruning, one of my favorite topics of all time. As far as tree interventions and maintaining those trees. So, what I'm going to talk about is tree pruning impact and response, but more talking about timing. The title's late season pruning, but I'm going to talk about not just that part of it, but just the pruning response that's involved when you prune, when we actually make cuts. Pruning's a important arboricultural practice that I think is understood by most arborists, uh, but the impact elicits some amazing things that go on inside the tree. It's a dynamic organism that responds to external stimuli, and the intervention such as pruning is one of those important things. Now, a lot of us do some research on what's going on with pruning, but by and large, we need to think about credibility as far as resources that go with what we're studying and what we're Googling. We Google something, it's quick information, it's convenient, but it's only as good as the source that you're looking at. And Google populates their search engines based on popularity and payment. So it's not always good information. So make sure you check that. So because a lot of I look at literature reviews all the time, and one of the things I see that's quite common is that many publications, especially Midwest, say that, oh, you can prune anytime. Anytime the wood's not frozen, or dormant season's the best time to prune, or prune just during the growing season. But it's very situational and based upon your scenario, your location, and also the developmental age and health and vigor of the tree. So that's what we're going to go with for this particular part of the program. And we're going to talk about primarily timing. Now, Kale's got us to the standards, which I always put this in every presentation. The standards are something that certainly are important for us as far as making sure we are following what I call the best management practices, and most people call them that because that's what we look at as far as guiding all of our arboricultural interventions. Research drives our standards, and these practices and new information produces a better outcome from our tree, and that's what it's all about. If you're not familiar with the ANSI standards, you see below there, there's a committee that's developed with a group of individuals from around the country that look at these standards and determine what is changed as far as research and information. And then the International Society of Arboriculture comes out with a complementary publication called their best management practices. And I will say, if you don't have this pruning best management practice booklet, the third edition, get it. It's probably, I've been pruning trees for 40 years and I've never seen anything so instructive and well put together as this particular BMP. It's basically the cliff notes of some very important information that from research from especially Dr. Ed Gilman from the University of Florida, and who I affectionately call the godfather of pruning. So we're going to kind of follow some of that information as well. All right. So first of all, we want to make sure that we're pruning according to objectives. And that is one of the biggest changes in the BMPs is once we get to work, and that means once we've got our tie-in point, we're up in the tree doing whatever we need to do as far as pruning, cutting on the tree. We need to have an objective, and that's one of the most important things is what is your goal when it comes to pruning? Why are you up there? You just don't climb. Well, we do recreational climbs and for fun, but there's a reason why we're up there. And so we need to know those objectives. So are we pruning for clearance? Are we pruning for a particular risk issue? Things like that. So those are some things that we need to think about. And timing of when that happens plays a big role in our objectives. Go ahead, Kale. So to make sure that we're on the same page, I like to call these generalizations as far as pruning goes. Um, we want to make sure that we understand kind of the basics or the essentials of that pruning intervention before we even make a cut on the tree. First of all, anytime you make a cut, especially in live green tissues, you're altering the morphology, which is a fancy word for basically the shape of the tree, but also the physiology of the plant. And we're going to talk a lot about the general effects of pruning and what that means. And then next, we're going to talk about what's left on the tree. You know, we talk about pruning doses and how much we're taking off, but really what's most important is what we left on the tree and how much live green tissue is there to actually support and sustain that tree after we're done pruning. And of course, next, it's important to remember that small cuts do a lot less damage to the tree than larger cuts. There's research that we'll get to here shortly that advocates for that, and I don't want to prelude to that too quickly, but we're going to talk about the impact of pruning cut size and also timing and how that changes the allocation of resources. And then, of course, the compartmentalization or code it. We want to make sure we understand that we need to consider species profiles as far as their ability to recover. And again, all that plays a role in timing as far as ring forest versus diffuse forest trees. And then, of course, the last two there, identifying the developmental age of the tree, where that tree is at in its developmental lifetime. Is it or a young juvenile tree? Is it a medium-aged tree? Mature, over-mature, veteran tree? All that plays a role as far as the impact of pruning and timing of pruning. And then, of course, assessing the health and vigor of that tree plays a major role in that as well. All right, so let's talk about some of basically the general effects of pruning. In order to determine how timing plays a role in this intervention, arboricultural intervention, we need to understand what some of the responses are. Most of the research, though, investigating these responses have been conducted primarily on fruit trees and timber production. So these findings may not be directly transferred to urban trees because pruning goals are completely different than the objectives. But it's important to realize that pruning does elicit a series of biological responses. First, where pruning removes leaves, which has an impact on the roots. We'll get to that here shortly. Also, if you're pruning live green tissue, you're going to have a loss of food supply and reserve capacity. Next, you also cause damage in the plant form and overall symmetry of the plant. If you are, especially when you're looking at utility vegetation management, oftentimes we have to create clearances as mandated by federal regulations. And oftentimes we're altering that morphology of the tree to a major extent, and how that responds to dynamic loading, such as wind, plays a role in that as well. We also, the big one we're going to talk about as far as relationship to timing is resource allocation due to wounding. I mean, as we're pruning, especially live green tissue, we're actually creating a reallocation of resources. And trees are very strategic about how they monitor their currency. And I like to talk about the currency of trees. A currency for a tree is carbon. And then finally, basically the pruning is just a overall suppression of plant processes. The summary result of pruning is actually just what I call a whole lot of lesses. Less shoots, less roots, less carbohydrate supply, less storage. and also as a result of those, less nitrogen uptake, especially if done in excess or improperly. All right, so first let's talk about hormones a little bit. Um, I raised a daughter, so I'm very well versed in hormones, and but also pretty good with it as far as trees go. So remember that first hormones are tiny little chemical messengers that has some amazing effects on plants and people. And they're found in just very small, minute qualities, but they have a huge impact on plants. All aspects of growth and development are regulated by plant hormones. And there's basically five major hormone groups that affect over 2,000 plant processes. Now, we're going to keep this pretty basic and group them into primary groups on as far as their relationship to pruning impacts. But hormones are produced naturally by plants, where plant growth regulators are applied to plants by humans. There's also been some misinformation about or used in as the same term, but actually they're not. Endogenous hormones are created internally by the plant, whereas plant growth regulators are what we use, like TGRs, to reduce the amount of growth in a particular season. But um, plant hormones and growth regulators all have the net or some result. Impact on flowering. Sometimes we want to reduce flowering. It changes the aging process on live green tissue. So there's a lot of things that the tree responds to depending upon the concentration. And also two or more hormones can interact to stimulate different responses. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, what I call the auxin cytokine pathway, the interaction of gibberellin and cytokinin with auxins as far as relationship to elongation of stems and lateral bud development. So on the next slide, you'll see a little bit of a graphic about what that auxin cytokine pathway looks like. So if you would, think of branches and stems a little differently. Think of them as highways or connective tissue that connects the roots and the canopy as one complex circuit that creates this growth control pathway. So these pathways, as we know, certainly transport food and water, but they also transport these little chemical messengers telling the plant how to respond to this external stimuli, its environment, our activities as well. You know, it still amazes me. The cool thing about this whole hormonal pathway is auxins are manufactured in the canopy at the growing tips, but they're primarily responsible for root growth. And the other major hormone is cytokinins, and they are manufactured in the roots, but they promote canopy growth. So, you know, I've talked about this for years, and it's still it's pretty amazing to me. So what happens is that downward flow of auxin creates a pathway from the terminal buds to the root tips. So the tissues that are in the root tips promote those cytokinins. So as they're passing in the night, these cytokinins like auxins are going to stimulate growth as well, but in that different location. So one inhibits the other. So cytokinins produced in the roots promotes this activity in the lateral buds. But if it didn't have any control at all, the tree would just grow out of control. So the auxins kind of inhibit that cytokinin, which results in what we know as apical dominance. So the more auxin is produced, then the more apical dominance it has. The less auxin that is produced, then we have a more rounder, or what we call we either have a excurrent shape or the rounded shape, and that makes a difference as far as how that tree grows. Now, in relationship to pruning, what makes a difference there is if we're removing some shoot tips, then we're going to have some major responses, and we'll see that in the next slide. So what happens is pruning doesn't stimulate growth as much as it really just increases physiological activity. So the loss of that shoot or branch tip just basically just completely screws up that auxin cytokine pathway. And so the production of this auxin to the transport to the roots doesn't occur. And so the cytokines produced in the roots are like up there where that branch used to be, as you can see in the image there. It's like, hey, where's the rest of the branch? What happened to you? So they accumulate right there. And so that's why we get this huge proliferation of growth. Basically, there's nothing to inhibit or say you need to slow down cytokine, and we got this covered. You don't get all this growth. So the cytokinin gets lost and accumulates right there, and we get these what we call latent dormant buds that are found just under the trunk, and they're stimulated. So this is why we get this huge amount of growth at the truncated ends of these branches that we've removed. So when you see topping and you see this huge amount of growth, that's what happens is basically, well, kind of like you see in the next slide here. And we'll go through some images of some examples. Well, one last thing there, the shoot expansion at the expense of root growth. I would like to say one thing as far as timing of pruning, especially during the growing season, critical points early in the growing season. If you remove a lot of live green tissue, the roots will respond by reseeding. And so, again, they're sending a signal because remember, auxins produced in the canopy have an impact on root growth. So if you're removing all the auxin, you're not going to have any root growth. So it's a very, very yin-yang type of thing that's important there to understand when you're pruning. All right, sorry, Caleb, move forward there. So these are just some examples of pruning that I've got thousands of them. I know for you guys listening out there, you probably don't see this where you live, but I still see it around Indiana. But you can see on the left there, those. We hope none of our guys watching this are doing this, but you see the ones on the left. Those were used to be nice honey locust trees, but they were pruned within an inch of their life, and you can see that proliferation of growth. The one on the right there was that's not a spar and not to be removed, but that was pruning. Obviously, not much left there. And then here you can see some excessive crown raising, which the only problem with those, you can see the amount of live green tissue down at the bottom there. The only problem with that is the fact that they were actually ornamental pairs, and they should have had one more pruning cut at ground level to get rid of those invasive things. Okay, and then we'll skip over that. It's a whole nother story or another time. Here's some topping ones. You can see, topping because of the excessive wounding and the fact that there's no live green tissue to support the recovery process is the reason why we get this dieback. And you'll see, really, those are just epicormic sprouts that responded to that accumulation of cytokinins near the truncated branches, and as a result, they're going to be stimulated, and it's just really weakly attached branches, just basically hanging on to the xylem vessels or the outer growing rings, and not really a part of the overall parent stem. Then you see, again, I mentioned the utility vegetation management guys. They're some of the best arborists and tree huggers I know, but trees aren't always planted in the right place or given consideration to mature growth, and they're placed in compromising positions to have to prune like this. And you'll see in the next slide what that looks like. Basically, one whole side of the tree was removed, leaving some large wounds, and obviously the recovery is going to be very suspect. Well, in fact, that tree's actually dead now. That was taken in here near where I live. And it happens on evergreens too. It's one of those things where if you're going to do that kind of thing, man, just cut it down and put it out of its misery. All right, this is my piece de resistance. And I just put this in here for fun. This was an actual tree care company that didn't have any type of lift device. And so they were pruning this large maple with scaffolding. It's a very old picture. It's when I was city forester in Indianapolis, and I just happened to drive by that. Damn near had an accident when I saw it, so I had to stop and back up and started walking up the driveway to see if I get a better look at that. Because actually, on every one of those platforms, there's a chainsaw on them, and so just the scaffolding alone is an engineering feat in itself. But the guy came out and ran me off, so I couldn't get any better pictures. But it was very creative tree care, nonetheless. So. All right, so just a couple more pictures. Again, obviously this is the topping that you see and still occurs quite frequently. I just took that picture like about a year ago, and there's still companies doing it, and it's certainly not good for the health of the tree. And because this is what we see, you can see that proliferation of growth on those branches that have been cut, and they're just very weakly attached. You could walk right up to those and just break them off because again they're just attached to those outer xylem vessels. Now there's some situations like you see on the right where they've been topped horribly, but decay is set in, and the problem is, especially storm damage, we might have to cultivate and create some branches to help the recovery process. Not all epicormic sprouts are bad. Sometimes it's a reiterative process to try to recover and reestablish the crown that has been removed as a result of excessive pruning. So it takes a lot of skill and experience and expertise, a little research on how to handle and actually restore plants that have been either damaged through storm damage or excessively pruned by basically a misinformed arborist, because there's options other than it's been topped, cut it down. There's some things we can do to rather than compromise the entire value of the tree. On the next slide, it shows a really interesting topping situation, or I guess I should say, those are black ash. I actually saw those down in Texas. I was doing a program down there, and they were intentionally pruned that way. I thought, what is he? He's just not done removing them. And you can see in the next couple of slides here, beautiful example of that proliferation of growth where, the roots are sending up those cytokinins to establish that elongation, stimulate growth. And then on the next, if you click again, Kale, you can see where those branches are just barely attached to the outside of the stem. But this guy does this every year. Now, he can only get away with this for so long because eventually that tree's not going to be able to support that because of the lack of currency or lack of carbon. So last time I looked, it's been a couple years ago, but they were still alive. So we'll see how that plays out. All right, so let's talk about the pruning effect on food production. And this is where timing really comes into play. So the availability of resources to the tree are absolutely essential in recovery to this mechanical wounding from pruning. And so if you look in the next slide, I'm going to spend a little time on this because this is what we really need to think about as far as our impact of pruning. And it's really all about that carbon. As I mentioned earlier, that carbon is a tree's currency. And research has indicated that really trees die from two things. It's carbon starvation or hydraulic failure, either alone or in combination. And so if you can find the culprit behind that, oftentimes we can figure out and determine why that tree died. The most obvious is a reduction in leaf area through pruning, as you can see on that little oak there. That the majority of our carbon is stored within the trunk. That's our carbon sequestration. Quite a bit in the roots and 20% in the branches, about 5% in leaf mass. But again, those are storage organs. And whenever we prune or reduce that leaf area, we're leading to a reduction in carbon fixation and assimilates so that this tree can bank that energy in those storage organs for future use. So at the same time, this resource allocation that's needed for recovery and defense through photosynthesis is reduced. So by that excessive removal of leaf tissue, we're basically saying, "Hey, I'm hacking on you, but boy, you just don't have the energy to recover." So what happens? That's when you get the decay and dieback and decline. So this leads to an increase in competition for carbon in other areas, such as growth and reproduction. So excessive pruning depletes the tree by removing that storage capacity. Now, a couple other things too. I've got in there as provide storage, structural carbohydrates and non-structural carbohydrates for growth and storage. We need to recognize that trees have different types of carbohydrates that are utilized for energy and resources in different ways. So structural carbohydrates basically provide the building blocks for the cell. That's what creates our lignin and cellulose, which are important for flexibility and basically standing strength. Where non-structural carbohydrates are the carbon reserves. That's the energy, ready to use energy for plant processes. And I'll get into that a little bit more when we talk really into about the timing as far as the time of year and when those are available. So remember, structural carbohydrates is basically the building blocks or the backbone for the tree as far as lignin and cellulose, but the ability for the tree, the leaves, the photosynthetic array to create non-structural carbohydrates to be used for carbon reserves is what drives the plant processes and the ability to recover from those wounds. That's a lot, but it's fascinating to me. One other thing when we look at trees and we look at some of these graphic representations of what lignin and cellulose and hemicellulose looks like, it is so oversimplified, and we think and we translate that into trees are just simple objects just standing there hanging out, giving us shade and oxygen, nothing important. But they are so complex in nature. I don't think we truly fully understand the complexity that a tree really has and the strategies it has to survive. To survive the worst pest in the world is an amazing feat on its own, and that's people, that's us, because we do some pretty crazy things to trees and they still survive. The next slide talks about what to do about the big trees. And this is typically what we're called in to do as arborists, is what to do about the big trees. And I don't think that we fully understand our impact of pruning when it comes to dose or timing and this ability to recover. The pruning dose is especially important, and timing on mature trees. So what we want to do is try not to remove too many of the older leaves, and also make sure that we realize that I get it. Sometimes I know I've had to do it myself. You've got a lot big infrastructure conflict, like in a municipal setting where a tree is blocking a stoplight or a street light and things like that. So we got to really take off a bunch of green tissue. But remember, we need to know the consequences of our actions when it comes to things like that and be able to anticipate that and help the tree out through that process. Heavy pruning doses stimulates a lot of epicormic sprouts, especially if we do it during the growing season. Now, if we time it late season, then we may not have nearly that flush of epicormic sprouts because the tree's going in as day length changes, temperatures change. The tree's physiologically thinking about endodormancy, and so but the good thing about some of these epicormic sprouts is, again, it's reiterative growth that can create additional energy resources locally from that recovery from pruning. Pruning does reduce carbohydrate levels, as I mentioned earlier, which means less growth. We can really control the growth of a tree, speaking of timing, if we prune immediately after leaf flush. So if you really want to, if you got a tree that's out of place or perhaps it's a fast growing species like an elm, and we're going to slow it down. We can use plant growth regulators, but also if we prune right after the flush of growth, we can really slow that dude down to a point where he's not nearly as aggressive. But as I mentioned, less carbohydrates, less growth. One of the biggest effects of live crown pruning, as I mentioned earlier, is on roots. As we're removing those oxygen, those growing points, we're going to have a recession of roots. We have a change in carbon allocation as a result of removing live green tissue. Also, older trees are really susceptible to decline if we prune early in the season, especially with excessive pruning and removing that live green tissue. Again, think about the currency of the tree, the carbon. We have a reduction in carbon fixation. We also have a reduction of other products associated with photosynthesis. So it's important that we understand that these energy reserves that are stored in the branches, stems, the woody structures, not removing too much of that so that the tree does have a bank of energy to draw upon whenever we have to prune to create less structural conflicts with neighboring structures like lights, houses, and things like that. All right, let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about timing. Now, based on research, and there's been a lot of research here in the last few years about timing and its importance on the recovery and the health of the tree. Now, this again is an ear full of stuff, but I think it's important to understand because this is the whole basis of this presentation is the timing. Now, if you're an advocate of Shigo, who obviously started all of our research in modern arboriculture, well, Shigo adopted what we call Ashkenazi's curve. And Ashkenazi was a Russian cherry tree grower, researcher that actually described what we call how potential energies modulated within a tree over a course of a year. And you can see on the curve, Ashkenazi's model shows that potential energy rapidly declines during leaf formation before it recovers through a period of high photosynthesis because we have all of this new leaf area, formation of leaves, which drops its energy. But because of that formation of leaves, we find that we have we get back to normal, basically. But what Ashkenazi is representing here is that in that spring, early summer period of time, it's a weak moment for the tree, which means that pruning should not occur during that particular moment. Now, on the next graph that we see, this is what we have kind of accepted now as our best model. And not that Shigo was wrong, it's just, again, the technology drives our technique and new research models and methods. But the growth cycle, and you've probably seen this, especially in your Certified Arbor Study Guide and perhaps some other books talking about this, but Kozlowski indicates that the cell activity is greatest during that period for virtually all components, not just the leaves, but also cambium tissue and the growing points. But basically, all components show the greatest cell activity, especially during that early summer months, which is just opposite of what Shigo said. Now, also, I might say that too, that Ashkenazi's curve is based on one species of tree, and that was Prunus avium, the cherry tree, whereas Kozlowski's curve was focused on a couple of different species, both gymnosperms and angiosperms. But again, going back to Kozlowski's curves, the key thing about the timing here is when you have no cell activity or poor activity especially in those parenchyma cells, which are highly responsible for its fungistatic properties to prevent decay, improve coat it, but also close up and occlude that wound. So basically, wounds heal and tissues recover more quickly and more effectively during these periods of highest cell activity. So instead of not pruning, again, a lot of our older models, they prune during dormancy. Best time to prune. Not necessarily so, because the parenchyma cells are not active. So they're not going to be able to recover from that pruning wound as quickly and effectively. So what the assumptions that we can make on this is, and we're talking primarily about non-structural carbohydrates. And as you remember earlier in the presentation, I said those are the ones that are responsible for wound recovery. So when we look at these assumptions, we're thinking we've got an increased pool of these non-structural carbohydrates, especially late spring, early summer, after the leaves have flushed. We also have an improved response to pruning. And also, again, it's important to go back and look at some of our silviculture guides and the fact that it's important to remember that ring porous trees have a greater demand on these non-structural carbohydrates in early spring because they are the ones, they have to create their conductive tissue brand new each spring. Diffuse porous trees have some conducting tissue that's still, they're filled with gas and they overwinter a little better. So again, timing of what trees to prune at certain times of the year it's a little more involved than what we previously or may have understood earlier. So again, this is kind of the neat part of all of this timing is how we can predict with pretty good accuracy and certainty how that tree is going to respond. You look at an old pruning wound that you prune. I go back and look at pruning wounds all the time that I've pruned. Just well, when you're a nerd, you do that stuff. But I look at this and I say, I pruned that tree 5 years ago at this particular time of year, and that wound has not closed. But I'll go back and look at some, and within a year, that tree's pruned based on just the timing that I made that cut. So the reason why certain trees recover better than others has a lot to do with its vascular system. All right, we talked a little bit about recovery and response to pruning. So let's talk about how trees do respond to pruning. Now, I'm sure we don't see this much either, bad pruning cuts like we see here. The next slide there, you can see some very good examples of flush cuts, rip cuts. And again, basically what we're doing is we're taking that tree's ability away to recover from that pruning wound. And what we're talking about is the coated process and compartmentalization versus decay. Now, you may have heard me talk about this before, but really, how does it help knowing how coated and decay works? Well, this is one that I did a few years ago in our nursery on the Purdue campus. This was at pruning, a pretty healthy, vigorously growing maple tree. And remember, once you make that cut, the race is on, especially depending on the time of year. If it's during the growing season when the parenchyma cells are active, but also remember the fungal organisms are active as well. So when you make that cut, it's like it's like when you drive by, McDonald's during lunchtime. You smell the food cooking. Well, these fungal organisms are very opportunistic, and these phytochemicals are out there, and insects and disease organisms have a place to land. And like, ha, I smell weakness in the tree. And so as a result, the race is on. So the tree is either going to quickly and effectively occlude that wound, or the fungal organism is going to insert its hyphae, insert that wood decaying enzyme that causes decay, and it's going to establish itself not through that pruning wound into the vascular system of the tree and spread. Now you can see in the next slide there, after 150 days, we can see that little wound wood donut ring kind of developing there. That's what we want to see. Now, yeah, you're going to have some decay and die back there, but it moves very slow. Remember, if the tree's healthy and vigorous and you cut at the right time, then the tree has a chance to respond and overcome through the various walls in the coated process. And then the next click, you can see after 360 days, hey, we pretty much got this covered, man. I mean, that's what we want to see. That's the goal. So that's the result of a proper cut at the proper time. Now, I realize too, hey, I'm a pragmatic um, arborist as well, and sometimes we don't always have a choice of when we can prune, when we want to prune, and so that goes into some of the things that I want to talk about next, as far as cut size. So you can see cut size plays a role in timing as well. So when we think about timing, we may want to make smaller cuts on those trees that don't have the opportunity to recover as quickly. This is just a pruning response as far as a deep flesh cut. But one thing that's really cool to see on this picture is you can see where the tree has been able to compartmentalize on the right as a result of a good branch collar cut. And on the left, you can see where we've removed some of the branch collar. And in that branch protection zone, there's some really specialized chemicals that help that tree recover from that wound. So the next slide talks about the research. Now, this is a culmination of, I thought, some very important research that it took me about 6 months to be able to pronounce his name, Dr. Dewey Siefken from the University of Hamburg, did a very intensive study with a large data sample set and found that, and Dr. Gilman has done some very similar research as well, and realizing that some trees are just more effective at compartmentalizing than others. And what that comes down to is basically just a difference in the tree's wood structure. Some trees are just better at this process. And again, the essential reason just lies in the proportion and amounts of parenchyma cells and also vessel diameter. And here we're talking about ring porous versus diffuse porous. You know, I looked at this chart and I've studied it before I really realized what that variation in timing role played in recovery. I'm thinking, softwood, how we group softwood versus hardwood trees. Well, oaks, hardwoods are just better compartmentalizers than softwoods. And so there is no connection between that. What it comes down to really is that larger vessels are, or ring porous trees especially, are less effective at compartmentalizing than diffuse porous trees. That's primarily due to the fact that those conducting vessels in ring porous trees are created new each spring. So examples of weak compartmentalizers, which plays a role in timing, would be like ash, birch, poplar, willows. Also, the more effective ones include beech, elm, hawthorns. Again, the difference between vascular systems make a difference. So we may want to prune later in the season on your larger vessel or ring porous trees because they're still developing that transport systems to move assimilates, energy, carbohydrates to from sink to source areas that are, excuse me, from source to sink areas so that they can get that energy that's necessary to help the recovery process. If you go back there just real quickly, Kale, again, I was up in one of these oak trees not too long ago looking at that. I had to take a huge branch, about a 6-inch cut on this oak tree on campus because it was interfering with service drop there. But that is compartmentalizing very slowly because I had to prune it in the spring, and also it's in somewhat of a decline. It's basically failing from carbon starvation and hydraulic failure due to construction going on around it. So you can see that wound wood tissue is just not occluding that wound as quickly as I like. So decay is really starting to take a toll on that particular part of the tree. All right, so when it comes down to it, the essentials as far as recovering wound occlusion, the essential pruning parameters are, of course, diameter of the branch, The age and health of the tree, the vigor and vitality, they're not the same thing. Vigor is a genetic trait, vitality is more as an environmental health trait. The vigor and vitality of that branch tissue plays a role in that. And the ability of that tree to compartmentalize wounds based on timing of our pruning cut and also the vascular system of the plant. So the ability for the tree to compartmentalize just basically depends on the timing of our cut and the physiological activity of those parenchyma cells. Again, those are highly important cells that have uh, a role in coating, but also recovery, and also the availability of stored materials and how much you're cutting. So remember, when you're removing a lot of those storage organs on the tree, you're removing stored materials. So you're eliminating or reducing that tree's capability to recover from those pruning cuts. So then basically, kind of to summarize that, trees will recover from pruning cuts if they have the time to overcome and win the race between the pest and the prune. The energy reserves. So if a tree, again, we could talk about pruning timing or pruning dose quite extensively. Again, it's about health and vigor. If it's got a bank of energy reserves, and it's going to recover much quickly, but also its genetic capacity to compartmentalize based on its vascular system. So all of that, there's lots of research that shows that in those race cells, they compose about 5 to 25% of the wood fiber, and the more of the parenchyma cells in those race cells, where it can kind of stop the movement of decay, will reduce the opportunity for that tree to poor health, basically. All right, let's see where we at here. Oh, let's talk just a little bit more on mature trees. One thing I wanted to say too, again, this is primarily where we spend a majority of our time is on mature trees. And this age range, I kind of follow the standards on this, and the fact that this is that age range of 50-year plus, and well, from a developmental perspective, have reached about 75% of their maximum size for that site, or they could be trees that are entering that retrenchment phase in their life. So pruning objectives need to be really clear, understood, so that we can balance the mechanical objectives with the biological needs of the tree. You know, we have objectives. We're there for a job, that, you know, pruning for health, removing deadwood and so forth, but we also got to manage the biological needs as well. So basically, the key things is really do nothing. If you don't know what you're doing, the best thing to do is absolutely nothing. Prune to improve structure. We may need to combine that with some tree supports if necessary. Also, we want to relieve any mechanical stress on the larger branches or branches with defects. And again, regardless of the goals or the objectives, we got to have the proper timing. And always, always prune on the periphery. We never want to prune on the interior of the plant. That is, as we know, lion's tailing, and it creates a real biomechanical nightmare for the tree in a lot of those situations. All right, so again, this is a good example of the lion's tailing there. I see a lot of that still occurring. Again, no interior pruning, man. That's just a big no-no for a lot of reasons. Primarily, again, you're losing a lot of those sun leaves, those big leaves that do a lot of photosynthetic processing. And also, from a biomechanical standpoint here, you're raising the center of mass, which you're putting an increased amount of stress on those branch attachments, increasing likelihood of failure. That's another topic for another time. So to sum it up, what I've been talking about as far as timing goes, it's like, hey, dude, when you get to the point here. So really when it comes down to it, and again, this is research-based, If possible, on poor trees we've identified as poor compartmentalizers, either from vigor and or genetic capacity or vascular arrangement. 2 inches should be the maximum size that we take, especially at any one time. Now, our objectives may require that we do more than that, but we may need to do some reduction cuts over a period of time. Now, on good compartmentalizers, 4-inch size cuts should be the maximum on trees. And really, if you're removing more than 4 inches branches, you better have a really good reason why you're doing that, because that's a huge wound for any tree of any condition to overcome. And so, again, that should be a major consideration. Think twice about that, because you're not only changing the physiology of the tree, you're changing the biomechanics of the tree as well. So as I mentioned earlier, the next point here, larger cuts. If you do have to take that 4-inch, 6-inch branch for some reason, consider reduction cuts rather than removal cuts over what I call sessional pruning over a period of 2, 3, 5 years. But I get it. We don't always have that opportunity with those clients. You're, one and done, take care of it, get out. But it's nice if you have those recurring clients where you can educate them and say, look, man, this is an important tree. So let's not stress the tree out by taking these large chunks out, and let's just take it down over a period of time, and the tree's going to recover and become a much more sustainable, stable element in the landscape, as opposed to just really destroying it and compromising its health as a result of those large wounds. So, like I said, advocate for that sessional pruning over a period of time. And if you're going to have to do some intensive crown removal and large branch removal, again, consider the species and the timing based on that genetic capability, and make sure you do it during the active growing season, because remember, that's when those parenchyma cells are most active, and that's when those are the ones most responsible for wound closure. And that's what it's all about. If the wound doesn't close, it's just a matter of time before decay destroys the tree. All right, I'm kind of finishing up here. Just got a few more slides. I want to talk about pruning intervention. This is just, again, a little bit of a recap. In addition to what I just talked about, remember, compartmentalization of wounding, that wound wood development is an important consideration, and it's based on our cut and also wound wood thickness, and remembering that necrosis, which is that death of tissue, is lowest after mechanical wounding at leaf emergence. So again, after leaf emergence, we have less necrosis because, again, we got active cells that are helping in that process. Wound wood thickness also increases that post leaf emergence. Another thing too, when you're cutting those larger branches, the more heartwood you have, the more deadwood you have, and the least amount of active cells there are for recovery. So the larger branches have a lot less growing capacity, active growing rings, I should kind of simply say, to close up those wounds. So last thing to remember there, growth is maximized, wound closure is fastest if pruning takes place during the growing season, because a lot of people advocate for dormant pruning. And it's okay on some things, but again, best biology dictates pruning during the growing season. Now, I got to add that caveat, pathogen transfer is a consideration. When we talk about oak wilt, got to remember that we don't want to do it while, especially, not necessarily when the fungus is active, but when that nasty critter or picnic beetle is moving and flying around and basically vectoring that disease. But again, I get it. Sometimes we got to do things we don't necessarily, it's not necessarily supported by the science that we so actively follow. So again, that's why wound closure we may have to use some type of wound dressing in order to prevent vectoring that disease. Now, as far as late season pruning in a nutshell, when we're pruning, we manage a tree, we're managing its reserve. So again, pruning trees produces a change in its partitioning of reserves. Again, trees are just amazing. Again, when we prune, we'll actually change how the tree allocates its resource. Some reserve sites will disappear as a result of pruning, and research that I recently read from a French study revealed that actually some storage sites will actually appear. So the recent research that I read showed that late season pruning management mismanages its reserves by removing important storage sites that are necessary for growth and recovery during the next season. However, early summer pruning, like where I live in central Indiana, in June or after spring flush, can actually stimulate storage reserves. So consequently, the spring pruning has the biggest influence on the growth rates, and slowing them down and it is expected because we're removing that healthy, photosynthetically efficient shoots and leaves that are during the growing season. And again, that can have a result in a shortage of that carbon, especially those non-structural carbohydrates that are necessary for vegetative growth. So as far as late season pruning, like now where we live, we can expect removal of those storage sites, which may slow down spring flush, but also for prune too early, and the tree hasn't, day length has a lot to do with that influence of dormancy. If they're still actively growing, we may get that flush of shoots, which may not harden off, and we can have some winter damage as a result. So again, it's a partitioning of that carbon reserves and how they store it, where they store it, and how much is available at critical times in that tree's development throughout the growing season in our temperate zones. Now I'm going to finish up with one thing I always like to talk about, because I talk about wound dressing, and I always get questions about this. ANSI standards prohibit the use of any treatments that damage tree tissue. Basically, they still sell this stuff. I go to my local big box hardware store, and I see it on the shelves, and I do my best to hide it. I'll push it behind some other materials or something so people won't buy that. Because if you look on the ingredients, it's a petroleum distillate. So will actually kill the cells we're actually trying to get to close the wound. So again, really the only thing you should be doing, the best wound dressing or wound benefit is actually just a good pruning cut. So the rest of the slide talks about tracing wounds. So if you have a pruning wound, perhaps you had a bad cut, you can trace it with some woodworking tools. Wound sealing perhaps is helpful. It's especially effective for minimizing infections and the spread of like oak wilt. There's some sodium silicate solutions that like tree bandage and stuff that have been around for a while. I really don't have any experience with those. Some folks are using just a latex paint, especially on oak trees, to reduce the spread of oak wilt. So now a lot of people on the next slide, we talk about lac balsam, and I've had a lot of stimulating discussions with folks talking about that. It is very popular in some places, but none of the research that I looked at failed to show any reduced discoloration or hastened wound occlusion. So on the next slide, you can see some examples of what that looks like. I think it has some merit as far as reducing the spread of the diseases as a sort of a prophylactic. But there's in the JOA, there is some supporting evidence that showed really Um, it really didn't help as far as reducing decay, but there were some improved results with some added fungicides such as thiophanate methyl, and of course we know tebuconazole, but the effectiveness really wasn't what I would consider significant. But as I mentioned, it is a good prophylactic for minimizing the spread of disease. Really, as I state in the last one there, really the proper pruning cuts and using pruning treatments are the best way to prevent or create a good barrier against those vectors. So, it's often a personal and professional choice as far as what you want to use there. But again, just follow the research. That's the important thing to remember. Uh, CRBM is what I always go by as far as my litmus test for any type of intervention or activity on a tree that's going to wound it or perhaps have the opportunity to compromise its health. CRBM, current research, best management practices. I mean, that's what we need to make sure that it's incumbent upon all of us as professional arborists to make sure that we follow the current research and best practice. It changes every year. You think, after 2,000 years of managing trees, we'd have it by now, but things do change. So I'm going to close here with just some key points here. Prune with intention and proper timing. Wounding requires extra carbon resources allocated to defense, but it does reduce the carbon pool. So only prune what you need. Prune according to the objectives. We have to balance the mechanical consequences with the biological needs of the tree. We need to prune just enough to accomplish our goals without jeopardizing tree health. And I always like to follow the dude, man. The dude abides. So we should abide by the physiological demands of the tree whenever possible. And I get, it's not always feasible, but if you have a choice and you have those opportunities, especially when you're looking at significant trees, historical trees that are meaningful in that cohort of that part of the urban forest that you're responsible for, then try to put biology ahead of the business when it comes to making some of those decisions. So that pretty much covers it. I want to give some attributions to some of my colleagues. I know I've had the opportunity to become good friends with a colleague, Ed Gilman, who's retired from the University of Florida, that's mentored me tremendously over the years with his research. And again, some of our rock stars, Andrew Hirons in Australia, and then of course Duncan Slater over in Myerscough College in England, and those are some guys that are, especially Andrew and Duncan Slater, are new and up and comers as far as research, and have dedicated a significant amount of time and resources and passion into developing best management practices with really good, credible research. So I think that's it, Kale. Shameless plug. Next slide. I've got to say that if you want to know a little bit more about pruning, I've written a lot of publications that I'm just the messenger. It's not necessarily my research. It's just my applied science coming out in these. It's sort of a synopsis and a collection of a lot of research and materials that I've reviewed and read. But a lot of companies have found them to be good training information. Also, they're great information if you're not a certified arborist, to study those, to supplement some of the materials that you have available to you, especially, even the certified arborist prep course that we have available on TreeU. So I think that's pretty much wraps it up, Kale. So that's a lot of stuff to talk about, man.
Yeah, that is indeed enough stuff to talk about. So,
As my daughter would say, Dad, that's TMI, but I will
well,
spend an entire week talking about pruning, and it's got all condensed into about an hour and a half here.
yeah, I'll say. I'm hopefully people have filled up their notebooks going over this because that's a whole bunch of information that everybody's got. I've got a couple questions here, some good ones. A lot of questions that were asked early on that you went over. First one, so Trevor asking that maple that you showed as your example of good coat it. Do you remember what time of year that was that you cut that?
Yeah, I actually pruned that in June.
Okay.
Leaves had fully expanded, and I watch for not just leaf size but leaf color. I know that's not always a good identifier, but the new leaves often have a reddish and a light green appearance. And one thing that's interesting about, and I'll get back to the question if I don't remind me, but one thing that's interesting about new growth is oftentimes we in the spring will see a red coloration on it. That's the anthocyanins that are present, and what they are doing is actually protecting those new leaves from sunburn. So that's
Hmm.
kind of a cool protective mechanism. When we see new growth, it often has a red tinge to it. That's just like sunblock
Hmm.
for these new leaves. But I watch for leaf expansion, leaf color as they start giving from that chartreuse to a more deeper green. Then I know they're fully expanded, and then that's when I think about pruning, especially maples. Which are typically poor compartmentalizers. So we got to be cautious with those, especially off peak as far as recovery potential.
I wish I had my own sunscreen protection. I developed. I desperately need that. Next question is a little bit off, but talking about ring porous trees. Joshua was asking if you have a tree that is perhaps too close to a driveway, so you can only really reach one half of the tree with fertilization. Um, is that fertilization, is pruning on that side going to end up affecting just part of the tree, or does that get transferred around so it affects all of the tree?
That's a good question. Trees are some certain species, and I really can't ascribe a generalization there, but I know um, certain species, especially ash. I've done a lot of research on EAB and ash, and they have sectorial properties, meaning that wherever you place something, like in the ground or in the trunk, it's going to stay basically in that sector of the tree. So if you fertilize half the tree, you're likely going to get uh, the greatest response in that half. Because a lot of times trees are kind of selfish with their resources, so they're not going to share with other parts. They're not going to move around the tree. It's like, oh, hey, he looks a little weak. Let's throw some stuff his way. But when you're looking at a driveway, once the roots hit that side of the driveway, the roots will follow that. So you may want to not just occlude it, or I should say exclude it, but fertilize along that driveway just the same as you would anywhere else, because there's probably a higher concentration of roots in that area, and so you will likely get a pretty good response as a result of that.
Okay. Elizabeth um, was asking about pruning roots, specifically about removing girdled roots and other misplaced roots, um, and what you need to be aware of for damaging uh, the tree versus letting it girdle itself.
Um, you know, Root surgery is really interesting topic, and it's not a fun job, but it's an interesting job because really you have the opportunity to save a tree that normally would just be on, that slow highway to, or what I call, the mortality spiral that looks like a toilet, cold flushed. But the kind of the rule of thumb is that you don't want to remove any more than 25% of the cross-sectional area of the trunk. So you would calculate the DBH to determine using the correct formula with pi and determine what the cross-sectional area is, and it'll give you a number of inches. And then you want to take 25% of that. Then that would be, I wouldn't remove any more root area than that at any one time. Now, depending upon the health and vigor and the age of the tree, the species, all of those play a role in that, in how much you can remove. Sometimes you can get more aggressive, especially if you're adding some, perhaps some compost, biochar mix type of stuff, and it's getting plenty of good cultural practices like watering. But again, you want to be careful. And also, if the roots are fused, you may have a reduced opportunity to help that situation out. But that's kind of the rule of thumb there. There's a really good resource on the University of Florida's website on root surgery. They'll kind of give you a overview of that. Ed Gilman's created a wonderful resource there for root collar management there that I think would be helpful.
Sticking on roots, is there a different timing for doing root collar surgery than there is on doing regular branches?
Oh yeah, I certainly want to do it while the tree's actively growing, because again, it's about getting that healing and recovery process as quick as possible, and the ability to apply some good cultural practices there as far as watering and mulch or a light compost mix. We do not want to fertilize. You never fertilize any tree that's under stress, and by conducting that root surgery, that's certainly the case. So just good cultural practices during the growing season is the best time to do that. In fact, we're kind of getting out of that period of time where I feel comfortable doing it now. I've done a couple earlier this month, but just getting close to that time where we may want to put it off. But don't be afraid to do it, especially if you've got a tree. Like maples are just notorious for that, and they're girdled, and what do you got to lose? The tree's going to most likely fail or die anyway as a result of those girdling roots. So try it out. Don't be afraid to do it. Just do a little homework, determine what you can and can't do. You may have to excavate the root collar with some type of pneumatic tool like air knife or something like that. But there again, don't be afraid to try it, because again, it's not a matter of if it goes, it's just when.
Okay, that's a good, because she was asking specifically because she was like getting worried about taking too much off. So that's a fantastic answer to that. And also you answered Tim's question about pruning and deep root fertilization, putting that together. You were talking about large cuts, doing a large cut at the wrong time. And Brian asked about if it would be a good idea if you have that sort of situation where you can't prune at the right time, but you need to, if you can do like a temporary stubbing of it and then coming back later at the proper time and giving it a good wound.
Yeah, and I've had some.
All right, everybody. So I guess that's that. All right, so I will see if Lindsey comes back. I think his iPad may have died. I don't know if he had it on. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you'd like more information, more talks from Lindsey, go to Tree Stuff and search for the Tree Use Certified Arborist course. Oh, here he is. He's back. Oh, Almost. Give me 1 second. I need to put you back in this little... There we go. All right, I'll turn him right way up in a second here. Hold on. Hold on. Everybody's freaking out. There he is.
Oh, there. Okay, where were we now?
Okay, yes, temporarily stubbing large cuts.
Oh, yeah. I've had an interesting conversation. Actually, last conference I was at ISA about that. Sometimes we have to do things that aren't necessarily great for the tree, and actually in the BMPs and the standards, it does indicate that stub cuts are acceptable in certain situations. Exactly like that. So you may not be able to make a good cut, and I would err on the side of caution and perhaps leave a little bit longer stub until you can get back and close and get a good collar cut, if you will, at the right time. But you got to make sure you're going to come back. So if you don't, then you just left a nice conduit for decay, which isn't going to help the tree at all.
That's a good point. And I think one of our last ones here. Oh, you said someone was the godfather of pruning. Who was that?
That's my unofficial affectionate term for my buddy Ed Gilman. Ed's done so much research on pruning, and he's my go-to guy whenever I have a quandary or question. So the BMPs are basically a great deal of knowledge and experience that came from all of Ed's research. His book, the third edition of Pruning, that's available probably on Amazon. But I mean, I bought that thing on Kindle just so I carry it with me on my phone. I mean, It's just fascinating. It's required text in my courses at Purdue.
Nice. And how many different classes was this condensed down from your courses?
3.
That you took? Oh, wow. Nice.
3. So it's kind of like the quick and dirty version of response to pruning.
Edward, I think this might be the last one. Edward Atkinson was asking, so we start late spring when the leaves kind of set. What is the signal for the time of year to stop pruning?
I don't really pay attention to the leaves as much as I do day length. Day length and temperature. It's easy for me where I live, and if you're in a more subtrop air zone,
Nicer.
I look at
if you live in a nicer area of the world.
Right. I look at day length. Day length and temperature is what signals that tree. It's like, winter's coming, dude. We got to prepare for this. But you will see the leaves sort of you'll start seeing some of the carotenoids or the yellows and oranges starting, and anthocyanins starting to come through, because the chlorophyll, the green part of the leaf, is so profuse and dense that it actually, anthocyanins and the carotenoids are always there. It's just the green is just so great that you can't see it. But once a tree starts slowing down its processes a little bit, the photosynthetic process, it's going into storage mode. And so then you'll start seeing some of the yellows, a little bit different shade there. Then we're physiologically changing, shifting gears, preparing for winter and dormancy. And so that's when your practices need to be adjusted accordingly.
Gotcha. All right. One more time, what was the title of the book by Dr. Gilman?
Hold on, I got it right here. No, I don't. It's a Pruning third edition. If you just Google Gilman Pruning on Amazon, it'll be on there. You can get it Kindle, and you can also get it, of course, hardback. I've got both, but that's one of the most important books in my collection.
Okay, great. Well, thank you once again for doing this for us. Everyone watching, thanks for joining us. Leave us a like. Share this if you can. If you'd like to come back for any of this knowledge, this video will be here forever. It will be on Facebook and YouTube, so you don't have to wait until the next time that we do this. You can just go back and get it right now. Is that an acoustic bass you have on your back wall?
Yeah, I've got acoustic bass. I've got too many guitars. That's just about half of them.
Nice. No such thing. All right, thank you very much. The link to the quiz is in the comments section. So good luck on that quiz, everyone.
Thank you.